I read a tremendous amount. As often as not, I read articles, magazine articles. In today's world, unfortunately, there's a real fast pace of life. So a lot of the times I have to keep up with news, economic news, political news. So a lot of that has to be done by reading articles. But I try to read books as much as I can, and I do actually read quite a lot of books. I'm not quite sure how I find the time to do it, but I do it. So it's one of the great satisfactions of my life, I have to say. You know, I find, maybe it's just some kind of strange phobia that I have, but I don't like to write in books. Somehow it feels like I'm violating the sacredness of the book. So I don't usually write in the margins, and instead I often, read, and then I have my computer next to me and I write notes next to me. And it's actually a pretty good way to do it because I can remember a lot. If I don't write things down, I find that I forget my impressions and I forget facts and quite a lot. So it's really nice. I have books that I read 8-10 years ago that I can still look back on my old computer and find what I thought about it in those days. It's nice. Various ways. I'm not a member of any book club, but I read a lot of, I'm from New York City, so the New York Times is my favorite newspaper, and when it comes to American English language books, I tend to read what the New York Times is writing about, among other things. There are a lot of book clubs that are very popular in the U.S., and I think here too. There's something called Goodreads, which is a pretty popular book site, but I'm not a member of that. So I see what's popular according to the major newspapers. Word of mouth obviously means a great deal. My daughter recommended some interesting books about kind of a revisionist view of American politics that I found very interesting. From colleagues, I get a lot of good advice. Sometimes, particularly, I guess because of the nature of my job, I meet people who have written books, and I'm always really honored when they give me their book. I always make them sign to Michael, and then a few words. But I try to read those books just because it's really nice to be able to read a book by somebody you've actually met. The subject may or may not be interesting to me, but I usually find it really fun to read the book anyway. As I say, the New York Times is one of my main ones, and there are other American newspapers that I use. It's the same is true in Russian. There's some literary columns that I read from Russian and Kazakhstani newspapers. Sure, but I'm not a member of a book club. No, nothing like that. I'm just not organized enough for that, and it's hard to keep up. Yeah, I think the best books are those that remind you of some important human quality that you want to reinforce. Because, life is full of challenges, and to be able to be reminded of something that you have to do better or some kind of quality that you should strive for is very, very important. So sometimes that's just something as simple as how to do something, a very basic thing. And sometimes it's really a question of the humanity. Obviously, the really great books talk about the humanity of people, their willingness to accomplish things in the face of extremely difficult challenges, hopeless challenges sometimes. And those are some of the best, obviously some of the best books, if they're done well. I mean, they can be done pretty crudely, in which case they don't really ring true. But when they're done well, they can really be, I guess the word is inspiring, and that's what I like. That's why it's sometimes fun to read biographies. Ideally, the biographies of people that one admires, although I guess you could learn from people you don't admire too, but I do like to read a lot of biographies because you do see how they coped with life. These are usually people that are outstanding in some way. Americans really like the Civil War period and Abraham Lincoln. And I've read several biographies of Lincoln. It sounds kind of trite, but the fact is, he was really an amazing guy. And when you read the books about him, you realize just how inspiring he is. In truth, not just as a kind of a symbol, but much more profoundly. So this is just one of many examples. You know, I guess I would obviously try to have somebody of the same personality type. In other words, somebody who overcomes tremendous challenges and difficulties and in some way demonstrates humanity even when it's very difficult to do that. Because obviously people make compromises, and the question is where to compromise and where to maintain your principles. But being a diplomat, I've lived in a lot of countries, so one of the things I've always dreamed of writing is books about how, it wouldn't have to be a diplomat, I don't want it to be too autobiographical, but books about people from a different culture integrating themselves into a society, understanding the new culture, dealing with it, and changing their own personality as a result in positive ways. I'd never forget, when I was in Poland, I used to go a lot to coal mines. Coal miners are really admirable people because they go down in dangerous, difficult, dark conditions and they come back, and they have, in Poland and probably elsewhere too, they have amazing traditions. And I've always thought about writing a book about how an American guy, doesn't have to be a diplomat, comes to a Polish coal mine town or something like that and finds his way, integrates the qualities, maybe changes them as well in some positive way. So that would be probably the character in some way that I would write about, probably in many of the books I would write, but unfortunately there's not a lot of time to write books at the moment. So. What I like to talk to? There's quite a few, obviously. If it's living authors, some of the people I've read biographies about would be really interesting to talk to. One of the guys that I really admire, I think a lot of people in the U.S. State Department tremendously admire, is Colin Powell, and he's written some amazing books. In fact, you know, it's one of his biography is one of the best biographies I think that's ever been written. So somebody like that I would very much like to talk to. But people that I've read biographies about, to see, you know, how they assess their biographies, how they assess their lives. It would really be interesting to see how they assess what was written about them, how accurate it is, how much it was distorted by the authors, and how much it truly reflects reality, and how much has changed since the book was written, how much that person has developed his or her own character. It's really interesting. Yeah, there are a lot of books that I reread. I served for, oh my goodness, 3 years in St. Petersburg, Russia, and I kept going back often. So I have reread Crime and Punishment more times than I care to mention. And it's partly because when you're in St. Petersburg, you really feel the spirit of that book, right? It's an amazing book, particularly because there's one neighborhood where the story ostensibly took place. And you can even see where Raskolnikov actually supposedly lived, right? So I've read that over and over. It's not only because I can see the places where he was, the neighborhood and so forth, but because it's really an amazing character study and a dramatic story too. I mean, it's really a great story. It's not just a kind of a complex character study, but it's fantastic. So that's one of the books I keep reading. I try to read it in Russian, and it's easier the more times you read it, because obviously it's much more satisfying to read it in the original language. I'm not a big movie fan, but obviously there have been a lot of books that have become movies, and some of them have been very good. Americans always talk about Dr. Zhivago. I know that a lot of people think the movie version of Dr. Zhivago is very much Hollywood-like. But actually it's a pretty good movie in its own way. It's very different from the book. So that's one that I thought was at least noteworthy, let's put it that way. And it's kind of a classic. Everybody in America, I think, has seen that book in its movie form, even if they haven't read it. There are some books that I've watched, movies that I've watched with my kids, and then read the books to them, and that's always fun. So the one that that I always remember is called Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a really nice book by Roald Dahl, who's a fantastic children's writer. So there have been two versions of that book, and to be honest with you, I think the first version is better than the second version without wanting to offend anybody, but I really do think the first version is wonderful because it captures the positiveness of the book, whereas the second one has a kind of a darker theme. Done deliberately, and it's a very interesting second version. But to show to kids, I think the first one is really great. So from a kid's point of view, I've shown that to our kids more times than I can think of, and I've actually read them the book as well. It's really nice. Oh, well, I mean, there's a whole range of wonderful books out there, and more and more and more books come out all the time, children's books. It's kind of amazing. And some of them have become much more creative now. Obviously, the creative process continues over and over, but Americans, a lot of Americans know a book called Goodnight Moon. It's a very, very simple book, but it's somehow, for very small children, it kind of gives them tranquility, I guess you'd say, and a sense of that everything is okay. It's a great book to read before kids go to sleep because they can go to sleep peacefully and in a little way kind of inspired and calm that the world is okay around them. But later in life, there's a whole bunch of books. My kids are by now well beyond that age where I can read to them. But there used to be really nice historical books series in the U.S. that I think were wonderful. There was one called The Magic Treehouse, and it was I don't know if they translated it into Russian, if it's available here, but it's a series of books where two kids find themselves in different historical contexts, be it the Roman times or even the dinosaur times, and when they get in really deep trouble, they can run back to the treehouse and escape. So that's one series that's really good. But there are many, many series like that. In America, there's something called The American Girl, which I used to read to my daughter. And again, it's an American girl. There are various of them, of various races and traditions and histories. And they've, they cope with the world around them, be it a pioneer girl living out in the middle of the Midwest of America in pioneer times. But in every case, it's the message is the same, basically, which is you need strength of character on the one hand, and you need to accept others, and that's a very important message. So I think those are really good books. It's such a popular series of books that on Fifth Avenue in New York, there's a store that's specially for American Girl dolls, but it comes from the book series. It's really very nice. I hope they do, because I still like paperback books, and I'm not yet used to reading electronic books. I read the newspaper and magazines online all the time, but when it comes to books, somehow I like the feeling of holding a piece of paper in my hand or a book in my hand and reading. It's also, frankly, easier for me because I try to read whenever I'm on an airplane, and somehow I find it easier to read it when it's in paperback. And you can also grab a book without having to buy it, without having to arrange it. So that's just probably my old-fashioned quality. So I'm not sure. I'm not actually sure if the paper version of books will last forever, but I kind of hope so, because I personally like it very much. So right now I'm reading a very odd book called City of Thieves. It's an American author, and it's about St. Petersburg in Russia. There's in St. Petersburg in the U.S. too. St. Petersburg, Russia, and during the blockade, and two guys that are looking for food in a special mission. It's a kind of an odd book, but it's actually a very, very interesting book. And how I exactly got it, I can't tell you. Somebody loaned it to me, and as usual, somebody said, "Hey, this is a good book," so I read it. I am reading it, but that's kind of unusual. It's just this is one of these books that I at least am reading just because I want to relax in the evenings. It's not a particularly scholarly book, but sometimes I like to read scholarly things, and it's very satisfying. And sometimes I read scholarly books about Kazakhstani history or Kazakh culture. That's fun for me too. That's really an important part of I guess, learning the surroundings that you're in. So we all have to do that. Well, from the point of view of American books, which is probably what I would talk about, there's some wonderful biographies. The one about Colin Powell is a really good one. There are wonderful books from living current American politicians that I find really interesting. And every one of those books tells the story from their own perspective. So it's important to read more than one book in order to really grasp reality. But nonetheless, I find those books really good and I would recommend them. I mentioned before how much I enjoy Civil War books. So there's some fantastic books about Abraham Lincoln and about the Civil War. For some reason, Americans find that the most interesting period in our history. Probably because in some ways, it's the most internally conflicted period in our history, or at least one of the most interestingly so. So there's a book by Doris Kearns Goodwin. She's a fantastic biographer that I'd recommend. I think it's called Team of Rivals, because it really shows Abraham Lincoln and several prominent politicians around him. They were very, very different, and yet this brilliant guy, Abraham Lincoln, was able to integrate them all into one team. And so it's a leadership book on the one hand, it's a book about a historical period on the other hand, and it's fantastically written, and it has a lot of personal descriptions of all these fascinating figures. And then, I told you before, I'm a guy from New York, and I'm very proud of it. So there are some wonderful books about the history of New York. And one of the best, again, it's a biography, is by Robert Caro, C-A-R-O, and it's called The Power Broker. Robert Caro writes books about people who have enormous power and how they use it. He's written several books about Lyndon Johnson, our president after Kennedy. But Robert Caro's book about New York City talks about this one guy, Robert Moses, and how he really transformed the face of New York, both because he had the resources to do it, but also because he had the strength of will and the political wisdom, or smarts at least, to do that. It's just a fantastic book. It's not easy. It's a long book, but it's really a fantastic book if you want to get a sense of New York City. But that's just a few of the many that I think are great.